Well, good morning. As we jump into the second part of our series, The Bad Boys of Easter, looking forward to jumping into these narratives that really capture the story of the people that were around Jesus right before his eventual capture, unlawful trial, crucifixion, and eventual resurrection. And in The Bad Boys of Easter, what we're looking at are the perceived villains in the story who contributed to Jesus' eventual death. But what they didn't realize is that while they thought they were in control of what was going on, God was actually in control of them. And we're asking this question over the next 3 weeks that all of us have asked at some point in our life, which is this: what do we do when God does not do what we want him to do? We're asking God to deliver, in a particular way in our life. We're asking God to answer a particular prayer that we've been praying. We're asking God to show up in a certain way. And it seems like it would make logical sense that a loving God would act in a certain way, and he's not doing what we expect him to do. What do we do with that tension? But what we find in the stories in the days leading up to Jesus is really three cautionary tales of three people that are asking this particular question in specific, nuanced ways that all of us at some point in our life have asked. We're looking at the stories of Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest, who ends up being the one who orchestrates the process in which Jesus will eventually be murdered. And we talked last week about how Joseph Caiaphas' attempt at control would eventually lead him to lose the thing he wanted to control the most. And today we're going to look at the life of Judas Iscariot, a man who ends up selling out his best friend and ultimately ends up losing what he desired most. And next week we'll look at the life of Barabbas, a man who had the opportunity to experience God for himself, but because of his own arrogance, missed the opportunity. And if we're honest, when we look at these lives, like Joseph Caiaphas and Judas Iscariot and Barabbas, it's easy 2,000 years later to look back on the lives of these men and think how foolish, how arrogant, how ridiculous it must have been for them to miss out on the miracle that was in front of them. It's easy to, from distance, look at their life and say, man, how in the world could they have ever done what they did? But what we'll find, and what we continue to find as we unpeel the layers of these narratives, is that there's a little bit of them in all of us. And in fact, when we recognize that little bit of them in all of us, that is the thing that prevents us from experiencing the free life that Jesus has promised us. The abundant life, free of concern and worry and stress that Jesus says is actually yours to have. And so I'm convinced over the next 3 weeks, as we look at the cautionary tales of these men, if we choose to do the opposite of what they did, we might experience more freedom in our life than we ever have had before. And so today, we look at the second bad boy of Easter, Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot, the treasurer and the traitor. Judas Iscariot, the man that history looks at as the person who betrayed his Savior and King, Jesus. But to understand the life of Judas, you've got to understand that Judas had expectations. You've got expectations as well. And Judas had an expectation of who Jesus would be, and he had an Old Testament expectation of this New Testament character. He expected Jesus to be the king and the Messiah who would come and upend Rome and reestablish the golden age of Israel. He was looking for Jesus to be who everyone expected Jesus to be. The great political revolutionary, the great conqueror, the one who would ultimately kick Rome out of the Holy Lands and make again the people of Israel the centerpiece of the strength of all of humanity. He had an expectation. And what we'll find is that Jesus did not meet Judas's expectation. That Jesus talked about a kingdom that he was going to establish. It just wasn't the kingdom that Judas was expecting. That Jesus talked about freedom that he was going to bring. It just wasn't the freedom that Judas was expecting. And oftentimes Judas gets a bad rap, but I want us to know today that Judas wasn't the only follower of Jesus that had these expectations of him. In fact, Judas was not alone by any stretch of the imagination. We find that Jesus' followers all had inside of them a little bit of Judas, a little what's in it for me kind of mentality. There's this story in Matthew chapter 19 where a rich man comes up to Jesus and says, what is it that I have to do to inherit the kingdom of heaven? What do I need to do to be able to live this full life? And Jesus says, sell everything you've got and come and follow me. And that young man walks away discouraged because the cost is too high to follow Jesus, and so he says no. And Peter, watching this, Peter, looking at the expectation of sacrifice that Jesus has for his followers, kind of leans into Jesus and asks this question immediately afterward. He says in Matthew 19:27, Peter answered him, Jesus, we have left everything to follow you. Like, Jesus, I owned a fish business and it was doing really well. I was about to sell the thing and make a whole lot of money and retire. I've left everything. The tax collector would say, Matthew, the tax collector would say, Jesus, I had left a lucrative business to follow you. This is a big deal here. What is in it for me? In fact, they would ask this question, what then will there be for us? In fact, would you say that with me on the count of three? For us, but say it like a question, like they would have been. Actually, let's just read the whole sentence. Ready? 1, 2, 3. What then will there be for us? What then will there be for us? A me mentality. But it just wasn't Peter. It was really all of the disciples. Because when Jesus would die on a cross, there would be no disciples there except for John, who was taking care of Jesus' mama. And when Jesus would be placed in a tomb, there were no Christians at that moment. There was no movement. All of the followers of Jesus abandoned ship, went back to their old jobs, and it was game over. Nobody was around at that moment. 3 years of their life wasted because the king really wasn't a king. He was just like everybody else. In Matthew chapter 20, verse 20, it's not just Jesus' disciples who do this, but Jesus' disciples' mama, because everybody knows if you want something done, you just ask your mama to do it, right? We find this in Matthew chapter 20, verse 20. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee, James and John, came up to him with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked Jesus for something. And he said to her, what do you want? And she said to him, say that these two sons, James and John, of mine, are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your kingdom. In other words, she was a first century soccer mom, all right? She's going to coach saying, you better play my boys. And she's expecting that one day Jesus is going to upend Rome and there's going to be a power vacuum, and she wants her sons to be in the positions of power. And Jesus did come to establish a kingdom. And Jesus did come to bring freedom. It just wasn't the kind of kingdom or freedom that everyone expected. And this would become a point of frustration and irritation for Judas. Because Judas was spending 3 years of his life wandering in the wilderness, following this rabbi, hoping one day Jesus would take all of this supernatural power, take all of these followers, about 500 people that followed him all of the time, take the capacity he had, build an army, use his strength, use his charisma to finally do what he had come to do, get rid of Rome. And everything kind of comes to a head in a particular moment when Judas realizes, Jesus isn't going to do what I've expected him to do. And this is the question that Judas would have to wrestle to the ground. And if we're honest, it's the question that I have to wrestle to the ground and you have to wrestle to the ground, regardless of where you are in your journey of faith. What do we do? What do we do when our expectations of God don't meet our experience? What do we do when we pray that God is going to restore our marriage and he doesn't? What do we do when we give financially like we're supposed to and think that God's going to come through when we need him and we don't get the promotion? What do we do when we're praying that God will handle this medical diagnosis and make everything better because he can, and it seems like our prayers fall on deaf ears? What do we do when we're not even asking for ourselves? We're asking for our kids. Surely, God, it's not even about me. It's just about my kids. Would you do what I'm asking you to do for my kids? And it doesn't seem like God delivers. At some point in our faith journey, we will feel this tension that God will not measure up to what we expect him to do. This was Judas's question. And Judas had a decision to make that you and I have a decision to make every day, and it is a hard decision at that. We have a choice to either celebrate who God is even when he doesn't meet our expectations, or sell out when he doesn't deliver. And all of this kind of comes to a climax in the life of Judas when he sees Jesus receive an extraordinary act of generosity, and he realizes that what he wants Jesus to do will never happen. Matthew chapter 26, verse 6, we find this story. Now, when Jesus was at Bethany, a city just about 1.5 miles away from Jerusalem, this location will be a big deal. In the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment. Now, this ointment was very expensive. Scholars say that it was worth a year's wages. So think about the average income in America, $50,000. This was valuable, it was significant, and it meant a lot. Most likely, this $50,000 flask of ointment would have been, in many ways, this woman's nest egg. It was what had been passed down from generation to generation to generation in the family as a last-ditch resort that if they needed to sell it off, they could for the sake of being able to make ends meet as a family. Most likely, this was in many ways her dowry. It was the thing that she would utilize in the moment of getting married to help continue on the legacy of her family. It was a big deal. And this woman walks into the room where Jesus is eating. She opens up the flask. She literally breaks the glass. And she pours all $50,000 worth of this ointment on Jesus' head. Could you imagine being in the room? This isn't some, on-the-shelf Chanel that you get at Walgreens, all right? This is a big deal. Verse 8, when the disciples saw it, they were indignant. They were livid, saying, "Why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor." Now, Matthew says it was the disciples that said this, right? But John, who was Jesus' best friend, John, who called himself the disciple who Jesus loved, John, who is more than willing to give us more information, John puts Judas on blast, all right? John outs the guy who actually instigated everything. And he says this in John chapter 12, verse 4. But Judas Iscariot, don't get it confused. It wasn't the disciples. It was Judas who started it. Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, he was about to betray him, had said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. But Jesus, aware of this, said to him, "Why do you trouble the woman? For he has done a beautiful thing to me. For you will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me." And at that moment, the disciples' heads would have kind of tilted a little bit. What do you mean we're not going to always have me? And then Jesus would say something in the next line that would have come as a shock to these men who were expecting one day to pick up arms and to kick out Rome. Jesus says in verse 12, "In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial." And at that moment, the disciples would have said, "Wait, what are you talking about? This ends with you dying, Jesus? We spent 3 years of our life wandering around the wilderness. We've seen you raise a man from the dead. We've seen you take a couple of fish and a couple of loaves and feed thousands of people. We've seen you walk on water, and you're telling me the way that this ends is with you dying? If you're dead, what happens to us?" And Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel, this good news of me dying is proclaimed in the whole world, what this woman has done today will also be told in memory of her." And it's at that point that Judas Iscariot is done. He's finished. Verse 14, then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" $50,000. Jesus, if she wanted to give you this gift, she should have just given it to us and allowed it to put it in our war chest. Do you know how much $50,000 could raise for an army? Do you know how many people in Israel we could join us and we could go kick Rome out? Jesus, do you have any idea how much that could have been utilized for us to accomplish my purposes? What I want you to do? And yet you're okay with this woman wasting $50,000 on your hair? You're not the leader I expected you to be. You're not the king I was hoping you would be. You're not who I expected you to be? And so Judas walks 1.5 miles down the road. It could not have taken him but more than 30 minutes. And he finds himself no longer at the feet of his rabbi, but at the feet of the men who his rabbi has been saying for the last couple of years are full of dead religion, are missing the point. And he looks at him and he says, I know you want him. And I know you can't get to him because of these crowds, but I've got the inside track. What will you give me if I can deliver him to you? And that question, that phrase, what will you give me? If we're honest, is a question that we have asked God before. God, what will you give me if I do it the way that you say I'm supposed to do it? God, what will you give me if I follow the rules? God, will you give me the marriage that I'm looking for if I just do it the way that you say I should do it? God, will you give me the promotion? God, will you give me the health that I desire? God, will you give me the kinds of kids that I want to have as long as I do it the way that I think I'm supposed to do it? And if we're not careful, look here, we can try to leverage God as a means to our ends. And let's be honest, we've all done this. You ever tried to bargain with God? Like you find yourself in a situation and it's like, God, I will never do this again if you get me out this one time. For me, if you struggle with this, just go back to thinking about high school days and trying to make curfew. Stacy lived about 15 minutes away from my house, and we were high school sweethearts. And I would remember waiting till the very last minute to leave her house, knowing that I was going to be late, getting in my car. And the road that she lived on had a bunch of speed bumps, but not like the small speed bumps, the big speed bumps that if you don't slow down and you hit the car just right, you'll break your car in half, like that kind of speed bump. And I remember praying this prayer pretty much every single Friday night as I ran into my car, jumping over these speed bumps. I prayed two things. Jesus, I prayed two things. God, would you please make sure my car is intact? Would you please make sure that my car stays intact? And God, would you get me home by curfew? Would you get me home by curfew? God, if you don't get me home by curfew, would you at least let my parents be asleep or let the clock break? God, just get me home. I'll do whatever you want me to do. I'll give you the rest of my life if I can get home by curfew, which is why I'm a pastor today. But if we're not careful, our bargaining with God is really just an insight into our own expectations of God. That we begin to believe in some way or shape or form that God is a means to my ends, that he ought to do what I expect him to do, and I can leverage my obedience, leverage my church attendance, leverage my giving, leverage whatever I need to do to get God to do what I want him to do. That was Judas. And so Judas asked the question, what will you give me if I deliver him over to you? And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. The cost to rent a slave for a day. The cost that you would have to pay another person if your ox gored his ox. Guess what you learned in church today? That was the cost. At most, 2 weeks worth of living expenses. If you could stretch it out, maybe a month. 30 pieces of silver in a little bag. And Judas would leave that place. In verse 16, we find, and at that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. Judas, for 30 pieces of silver, would turn his back on the man who gave him access to a life he never imagined, who gave him the front row seat to the miracle of walking with God in skin and bone. The one who would look him in the eyes and love him like no one else had ever been loved. Judas would turn his back because at the end of the day, Jesus wouldn't do what Judas expected him to do. And so Judas would find an opportunity. A couple of days later, Jesus would be at the Passover meal late at night. He'd take off his rabbinical robe. He'd tie a towel around his waist. He'd wash the feet of all of his disciples, including Judas, who he knew was going to betray him. And he would say out loud, one of you today is going to betray me. And all of the disciples would begin to chat and talk about, who's it going to be? It's not going to be me. Well, it's probably Peter, because Peter always talks a lot. You can imagine all of the debate and the argument that's going on. And could you imagine being Judas at this moment? Jesus says out loud, one of you is going to betray me, and you know that it's going to be you, and you know that Jesus knows everything, and you think, is this the day when Jesus outs me in front of everybody? And Peter's been carrying the sword around, thinking he's a tough guy, and maybe he's actually going to use the sword today. This is where my life ends, right? That's what I'd be thinking. I'd be nervous. And in the midst of all the commotion, Jesus leans over to Judas, and he says, what you are about to do, go and do quickly. And Judas would excuse himself. And Jesus and his disciples would retire to the Garden of Gethsemane where they would pray. And eventually Judas would come with the chief priests. He would kiss Jesus on the cheek, and Jesus would be arrested. And Jesus would be tried unfairly. And eventually Judas, who thought Jesus would just get pushed around, knocked around, surely he didn't believe the man who could disappear at any moment, the man who could walk on water, would ever allow himself to actually die at the hands of these Jewish priests. The Jewish priests weren't even allowed to kill people, so he didn't think it was going to go that far. But at the moment that Judas begins to hear that Caiaphas has met with Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, he recognizes that this isn't just about pushing Jesus around. This ends in death. And Judas, anxious, recognizing what he has done, runs to the temple to give the 30 cents or the 30 silver dollars back to the chief priests. And they would look at him and say, we don't want it anymore. This is your responsibility. Which is true. Look at me. When you and I choose to no longer follow God in a place in our life because he's no longer meeting our expectations, when we try to take control of what is ultimately God's to control, it then becomes our responsibility. And the outcomes become ours. And for many of us, our greatest regrets in life involve us taking something from God that was God's to begin with, thinking we could do it better. And Judas would toss those coins, ravaged with guilt, eventually hang himself on a tree and die. And I want you to see something today, because there's a little bit of Judas in me and a little bit of Judas in you. Judas's disappointment in Jesus would lead him to sell out his friend, miss the miracle, and eventually lose his life and his soul. How did he miss the miracle? Well, his choice to hang himself because of the guilt that he carried would mean that while Jesus was crucified, 3 days later when he would rise, Judas would not get a front row seat to seeing his Savior alive again. His story ends in tragedy because he tried to do it on his own. Here's the truth. The truth is you can build a faith that's centered on you, or you can build a faith that is centered on God. You can build a faith that is centered on you or on God. And a me-centered faith that is focused on God, you need to do what I want you to do and get it done when I expect you to do it. A faith that centers on me ends in disappointment, discouragement, and disillusionment. But a faith that centers on God leads to gratitude, generosity, and unshakable joy. And the question for you is, which one is your faith centered on? If you find your faith today disillusioned and disappointed in God, it may be because you've expected God to do things that you have expected him to do that he's not obligated to do. That God, I expected you to do this and you haven't, so I'm leaving. Or God, I no longer can trust you in this area of my life because I've got to take it on my own because I don't think that you're going to come through the way that I expect you to. Who promised you that God was going to do what you wanted him to do in the first place? And what obligates God to do that? He's God, and we're not. We do not, or God rather does not exist for us. Are you tracking with that? We exist for God. Which herein lies the tension. The tension that you feel and I feel. Can I trust that God will do what's best for me and those that I love? Can I trust that God is going to allow my marriage to move forward in the best way? Can I trust that God's going to let my kids live the life of flourishing I've always dreamt for them? Can I trust that I'm going to get the promotion that I think that I need? Well, here's the answer to that question. The truth is this, is that God doesn't promise that we'll get what we want. He promises that we'll get him. And the real question underneath all of that is this. Is that enough? Is it enough that if the diagnosis never changes the way you want it to change, that if you get God, it's enough? Is it enough that if things never work out the way in your marriage that you want them to work out, that it's enough? Is it enough that if your kids never turn out to be what you hoped that they would be, that it's enough? Is it enough that if you want to be in a relationship and you never get that relationship, that it's enough? That if you have God, it's enough? Because here's what I can promise you, is that God only gives you exactly what you need when you need it. And that you would do the same thing God is doing right now in your life if you could see it the way that God saw it. So here's the question. What are you experiencing, or what are you expecting God to do for you that he isn't obligated to do? Like, what is the thing you're like, God, I expect you to do this. God, make this right. And God is not obligated to do it. Because I would submit to you that that very place is the place where you're most likely to leave God and go to something else. Like Judas left Jesus to go and sell out everything he had, a relationship with the God of the universe, for 30 silver coins, so many of us have either sold out or will eventually, if we're not careful, sell out to something far less that we'll eventually regret anyway. It'll give us a sense of control for a moment, but then that moment will pass and we will find that the thing we wanted in the first place we now have and don't want at all. So let me encourage you today. Don't sell out. Don't sell out. Know that God is not obligated to give you what you want, but God promises he will give you he will give you himself, and that is what you need most. And trust that he's the only place your soul will find rest. There is no other place you can go to. There's no other relationship you will ever have that will give you what God can give you. Peace, hope, and joy. And when you, like me, struggle to believe that God is for you, when you, like me, struggle to say, God, this makes logical sense that you would just deliver on the things that I've asked you to do. God, I want to have a great marriage. Why won't you let me have that? God, we want to have more kids. Why won't you let us have more? God, we want to be in a better financial position so we can help more people. Why aren't you letting us do that? When you hear God say no, or when God is silent, I want to remind you of this, is that God's no is oftentimes because he has a better yes. And that God doesn't just say no to me and you. He said no to his very son. That on that same day that Jesus would be betrayed, Jesus would sit down in a garden and pray to his heavenly Father this. He would say, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. He knew the crucifixion was coming. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. 3 times Jesus would ask God to come up with another way to not have him die. 3 times he would say, God, I do not want to experience your crucifixion. 3 times he would say, God, if there's any other way to do this, let's do it another way. And look here. God's no to Jesus was his yes to you. God's no to Jesus was his yes to you. Because God didn't give Jesus what he asked for in his time of need, because he knew what you and I needed was a Savior. And that the means by which that would happen would be God saying no to Jesus' request. That Jesus would die a terrible death so that 3 days later he could defeat it. So that every single moment, every single day, we can know that even when God doesn't give us what we want, we know that he'll give us what we need. Ultimately, a relationship